She stood behind the screen door at 9:50, hand on the porch light switch, because in 1954, that flick alone could end a courtship. In the years after the war, courtship in America ran on its own strict grammar, taught in etiquette manuals, home economics classrooms, and magazine advice columns read by nearly every teenage girl in the country. A boy did not simply ask a girl out. He called at her house. He waited on her father's approval. He proved himself before he ever touched her hand. 30 of these unwritten rules survive in the record, and one of them, buried in state law, could actually land a broken engagement in a courtroom. A young man did not simply meet a girl downtown for a soda if he wanted to court her properly. He came to her house first, knocked on the front door, and stood in the parlor while her mother looked him over. Only after that did anyone discuss where the two of them might actually go. This was called calling, and getting it wrong in front of her mother could end a courtship before it ever started. The ritual existed because a family's reputation traveled through its daughters, and a mother wanted proof a suitor was serious before he was left alone with her. Etiquette manuals of the decades spelled out the choreography in detail, down to how long a young man should sit in the parlor before the girl was allowed downstairs. A caller who skipped the visit and simply honked from the driveway was considered close to an insult. Word of a rude entrance could travel through a small town faster than the date itself. What the parlor visit protected was slower than modern dating ever bothers with, a small stretch of time where a mother, not an algorithm, decided whether a stranger deserved a second look. When the practice faded in later decades, so did that built-in pause, the one moment before a couple was ever truly alone together. But calling at the house was only the first hurdle. The real gatekeeper of the household was waiting in the next room, and he was not nearly as easy to charm as her mother had been. Before a young man could take a girl steady, tradition expected him to ask her father directly, man to man, usually in private. This was not a formality to breeze through. A father might ask about a young man's job, his prospects, his church, and how he intended to support a family before he ever agreed to let the courtship continue. Some fathers made a suitor wait weeks for an answer, turning a simple yes into a small trial of patience. A young man who skipped this step and simply started dating a girl without her father's blessing risked the whole courtship being cut off before it had a real chance. Etiquette writers treated his approval as the true starting gun of a relationship, ahead of any date itself. It meant a girl's romantic life was, on paper, subject to a man other than the one courting her. That imbalance sat quietly underneath nearly every rule that followed, including the one waiting the very first time a couple was allowed out the door together. Even after a father approved a match, a young couple was rarely left completely alone in the earliest visits. An older sister, an aunt, or the girl's mother herself might sit within earshot during a first parlor visit, present enough to matter, but polite enough to pretend not to be listening. For younger couples especially, group outings with other chaperoned pairs were the expected first steps rather than a private evening for two. The chaperone was not there to spy so much as to make sure nothing happened that a girl's reputation could not survive. By the 1950s, chaperoning had loosened, but it had not disappeared, and plenty of mothers still found reasons to be in the next room during a young man's visit. Some couples treated the arrangement almost like a game, finding small pockets of privacy on a porch swing while a chaperone stayed politely out of earshot. What it protected was a girl's word in any dispute, since nothing improper could be alleged with a witness present. That protection mattered more than it sounds, especially once a couple stepped outside and into full public view. Out on the sidewalk, a young man was expected to walk on the side closest to the street, putting his own body between his date and any passing car or splash of gutter water. It was such a basic rule that forgetting it, even once, could draw a raised eyebrow from an older woman watching from a porch. It looked like a small thing, but small things were exactly how the whole system was graded. The habit traced back to a practical origin. an era when horse traffic and splashing carriage wheels made the street side of a sidewalk an actual hazard to a woman's dress. By the 1950s, the danger was mostly symbolic, but the gesture had outlived its purpose and become pure signal instead, a small physical proof that a man was paying attention. That same logic, a small gesture proving a much larger commitment, ran through nearly every rule of the era, especially the one about who reached for a door first. A man was expected to open every door his date walked through that evening: the car door, the restaurant door, the door to her own house at the end of the night. He walked around the car to let her out rather than letting her climb out on her own, and he did it without being asked every single time. Skipping it once might be forgiven as an oversight. Skipping it as a habit was read as a quiet signal that a man was not serious, or worse, not raised right. Charm guides of the period drilled this kind of small physical courtesy into young men almost like a checklist, because a girl's friends and family were watching the whole performance closely, ready to report back on how attentive a new suitor really was. The habit was so widespread that its absence, more than its presence, was what people actually noticed and talked about. And attentiveness did not stop at doors. It extended straight into a man's wallet, on a rule that left absolutely no room for splitting anything. A man paid for the movie tickets, the malted milk afterward, the gas in the car, and anything else the evening called for, without ever glancing at a bill. Letting a woman pay was a genuine social misstep, the kind of thing that could make a girl feel judged as cheap company. A young man on a tight budget simply planned a cheaper date, a walk, a soda fountain, a free concert, rather than ever letting her cover part of the cost. The rule was tangled up with a much bigger idea about what a man was supposed to prove before marriage, that he could actually provide for a household on his own income. Paying for a date was treated as a small rehearsal for paying the family's bills for the next 50 years. A young man saving toward marriage sometimes had to budget an entire week spending money around a single Saturday night date, and everyone around him understood exactly why. What eroded once dating norms shifted was not the courtesy itself so much as the assumption baked underneath it that a woman's evening, and eventually her whole household, was financially someone else's job to manage. That assumption quietly shaped who asked whom out, who set the pace of a relationship, and who held the actual leverage to end it. The uneven power sat there under nearly every polite gesture, ready to resurface the moment a couple's evening ended, and it was time for him to actually walk her home. At the end of a date, a young man did not drop a girl off at the curb and drive away. He walked her all the way up the path to her actual front door and waited until she was safely inside before he left. In many households, this was also the moment a father or mother got a good look at what kind of state their daughter had come home in. How the young man behaved in that final minute mattered enormously to whether he would be invited back at all. A goodnight kiss, if there was one at all, tended to happen on that porch rather than in a parked car, in plain view of a house likely still watching from behind a curtain. The whole sequence was compressed and public by design, leaving little room for anything a neighbor could not have witnessed. That same porch and the light switch beside its door would go on to run one of the strictest unwritten rules of the entire decade. Most girls had a curfew, often somewhere between 10 and midnight, depending on her age and her parents' strictness, and the porch light was the household's actual enforcement tool. A lit porch light meant a couple still had time. A porch light switched off, or flicked on and off in a warning, meant it was time for the young man to leave immediately, no further negotiation required. Some fathers timed it down to the minute, standing just inside the door with a hand on the switch, watching the clock as much as the couple. The signal worked precisely because it required no confrontation at all. A father never had to walk onto the porch and interrupt a goodnight kiss. He simply reached for a switch inside his own hallway. For a couple lingering on the steps, that light was as loud as a shouted warning. A missed curfew of even a few minutes could mean the difference between a suitor being welcomed back the following Saturday and quietly not being invited at all. What the porch light really measured was trust, extended in small nightly increments and revoked instantly at the first sign it had been abused. A daughter who came in late once might get a stern word. A daughter who did it twice might find her next date required a chaperone again, undoing months of earned independence in a single night. That same instant, silent communication ran through the household's telephone too, except everyone on the party line could hear it, not just the family inside. Many households in the 1950s, especially outside big cities, still shared a single phone line with several neighboring families, known as a party line. Every household on that line could pick up and listen to any call in progress, and plenty of people did exactly that of pure curiosity. A young man calling to ask a girl out, or a couple having a quiet argument over the phone, might unknowingly be entertaining half the block at the same time. Courting couples adapted quickly, developing a coded shorthand for anything they did not want the whole party line to overhear, saving real conversation for an actual visit instead. Calling too late at night was its own small scandal, since a ringing phone after a certain hour woke every household sharing that line. A girl's parents often kept an unofficial rule about which hours a boy was allowed to phone at all, and breaking it drew attention from every family on the block by morning. The lack of privacy pushed real intimacy back toward paper instead, since a letter, unlike a party line call, could not be overheard by a curious neighbor lifting a receiver. And for one entire slice of the decade, letters were not just a private alternative to the phone. They were sometimes the only way a couple could talk to each other at all. When the Korean War pulled young men overseas between 1950 and the armistice in 1953, letter writing became the entire courtship for thousands of couples separated by an ocean. A soldier's letters home were read, reread, sometimes read aloud to girlfriends by the light of a kitchen table, then folded carefully back into a shoebox, kept under a bed. A girl might wait weeks between letters with no way of knowing if her sweetheart was even still safe, and the arrival of an envelope in his handwriting could reorganize her entire week around it. Writing itself became a courtship skill, since a man's whole personality had to travel through his handwriting alone. Some women fell for a man they had barely dated before he shipped out. Did anyone in your own family ever save letters like that, tied up with string, or kept in a drawer for decades? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Not every one of those wartime courtships made it to the altar, and the ones that did not left behind letters nobody ever fully explained. What the war years proved was that the unwritten rules were never really about the porch light or the party line. They were about building trust slowly enough to survive real distance and real fear. Once instant communication became possible, that slow proof of character mostly disappeared along with the shoebox of letters. But even couples who never spent a day apart still had to prove they were serious, and by the 1950s that proof had its own accessories, worn in plain sight for the whole town to see. By the early 1950s, going steady had become the defining stage of teenage courtship, and it came with its own visible uniform. A girl wearing her boyfriend's class ring on a chain around her neck, or wrapped in tape to fit her smaller finger, was making an announcement to every hallway she walked through. A letter sweater draped over her shoulders at a football game did the same job, and these were not casual accessories. They were public declarations that a couple had moved from dating around to being exclusively, officially a pair. Sociologists and newspaper writers at the time were genuinely divided over whether going steady was healthy or dangerous, since some parents worried it pushed teenagers toward premature intimacy, years before they were anywhere near ready for marriage. Schools sometimes tried to discourage the practice outright, and a few even considered banning class rings from being worn as a steady-going symbol on campus. None of that stopped the trend, and by mid-decade going steady had become the expected norm rather than the exception, worn on a chain for the entire school to see. What going steady actually offered a teenager was clarity, an end to the guessing game of whether someone liked you back, replaced by a piece of jewelry that answered the question before anyone had to ask it out loud. That same appetite for a visible, unambiguous signal, something a whole community could read at a glance, would only grow stronger as a couple got more serious. Especially once a young man belonged to a fraternity and had an actual pin to give away. On college campuses, the step above going steady was being pinned, when a fraternity man gave his own fraternity pin to a woman as a semi-formal promise that an engagement was likely coming. The ceremony itself was often a small production, with a young man's fraternity brothers gathering outside the woman's sorority house at night, singing a traditional pinning song while she came out to accept the pin in front of everyone. Being pinned sat in a strange, well-understood middle zone, more serious than going steady, but not yet an actual engagement ring, and everyone on campus knew exactly how to read the signal without it needing to be explained. A pinned woman was considered essentially spoken for, and another man asking her out at that point would have been a genuine social violation. The pin itself became a kind of trophy and proof at once, worn on a sweater where the entire sorority house could see it. What the pinning ceremony really did was let a whole community witness a private decision before the couple had made anything legally official, moving a couple visibly through calling, going steady, pinned, and engaged long before anyone said the word marriage out loud. That same instinct, making a private choice into a public event long before the wedding itself, ran straight through the entire engagement process, starting with the moment a couple's news reached the local newspaper. Once a couple was formally engaged, the news did not stay private for long. Nearly every local paper ran a society page, and an engagement announcement with a photograph of the bride-to-be was considered a near-mandatory step, especially in smaller towns where the paper's society editor might personally know the family. The wording followed a fairly rigid formula, naming the bride's parents first, then the groom, then the schools each had attended, and the church where the wedding would take place. Skipping the newspaper announcement drew its own quiet commentary, since it could be read as financial embarrassment or a sign something about the match was being kept deliberately quiet. For a young woman, seeing her own name and photograph in print made the engagement feel real to the entire town at once. And printed announcements were only the public half of the ritual, since the other half sat on her finger, and it was about to become the most expensive rule on this list. By the 1950s, an engagement without a diamond ring was almost unthinkable for a middle-class American couple, but that expectation was newer than most people assume. The De Beers Company had launched its now famous advertising campaign built around the line "A Diamond is Forever" back in 1947, working with the NWA agency to plant the idea that a diamond, specifically, was the only acceptable proof a man was serious, whether or not he could actually afford one. Before that campaign, a diamond was simply one option among several respectable choices, and plenty of earlier engagement rings used birthstones, pearls, or no stone at all. Advertising copy from the campaign suggested a ring should cost roughly a chunk of a man's salary, turning a private decision into something neighbors could measure and judge. The core message, "Spend visibly to prove your devotion," was already firmly in place by the 1950s, and it worked so well that most people today assume it was never a marketing message at all. Diamonds became so fused with the idea of a serious proposal that a man who chose something else risked being read as cheap or worse, not truly committed, even though the whole expectation was barely one generation old by the 1950s. And remember, one of these 30 rules could still end up argued in front of a judge. We are getting close to it. Before we get there, though, there is an entire chest full of household linens a bride had usually been filling since she was still a girl. Long before a girl had a suitor, she might already own a hope chest, a wooden trunk kept at the foot of her bed where she stored linens and embroidered pillowcases for a marriage that had not happened yet. Mothers and grandmothers often started the tradition when a daughter was still in grade school, adding a tablecloth or towels a few pieces at a time over years. The chest itself became a kind of quiet, physical countdown, sitting in a bedroom corner as a constant reminder of the marriage everyone assumed was coming eventually. Filling a hope chest was treated as a genuine skill, one taught alongside sewing and embroidery in home economics classes, and a well-stocked chest by the time a girl was engaged said something real about her preparation and character. Friends and relatives sometimes contributed a piece as a gift, turning the chest into a kind of running record of a girl's whole extended family. A chest that stayed noticeably empty as a girl got older could quietly invite the kind of comment nobody wanted said about them out loud. The hope chest assumed something that would eventually stop being assumed, that a young woman's household future was decided long before she had even chosen a husband. When that assumption faded, so did the chest, and the practical skills bundled inside it. Embroidery, mending, linen care faded into something closer to a hobby than a necessity. A girl who spent a decade filling one still owed a thank you note for every gift that went into it, and that rule had no exceptions. Every gift, every dinner invitation, every kindness shown during a courtship was expected to be answered with a handwritten thank you note, mailed promptly, never typed and never skipped. Etiquette manuals were extremely specific about timing, generally within a day or two of receiving a gift or attending an event, and a note that arrived late was noticed just as clearly as one that never arrived at all. A young woman was expected to keep proper stationery on hand specifically for this purpose, and a man courting her seriously was expected to notice whether she did. The habit extended into engagement gifts, wedding gifts, and the thank you notes a bride sent after the wedding, sometimes numbering well over 100 for a large ceremony. Skipping one was a real social cost, since a family that received no acknowledgement felt entitled to mention it for years afterward. That same instinct toward small, constant social bookkeeping was nothing compared to the much larger, far less forgiving ledger every unmarried woman was quietly being kept on by everyone around her. A woman's reputation in the 1950s was treated as a fragile, almost public asset, something the whole community felt entitled to monitor, discuss, and judge. Being seen too often with too many different men, staying out past a reasonable hour, or simply being the subject of the wrong rumor could follow a girl for years, shaping who was willing to court her seriously afterward. Gossip networks, church social circles, and small-town grapevines functioned almost like an informal surveillance system, and very little about a young woman's romantic life stayed truly private for long. Men operated under a strikingly different standard for the exact same behavior, a double standard the era rarely bothered to hide. A young man who dated several women at once, or was rumored to have gone further than he should, faced little social cost, while a woman in the same situation risked being labeled in ways that stuck. This imbalance was not hidden. It was written plainly into the etiquette manuals and advice columns of the decade, which policed a girl's conduct far more than a boy's. What this meant, in practice, was that a woman entered every courtship carrying real financial and social stakes a man simply did not share. And nowhere did that imbalance show up more plainly than in what actually happened when an engagement fell apart. A broken engagement was rarely just a private heartbreak. For a woman whose reputation and prospects had been built around an expected marriage, it could be treated as an actual financial injury, one serious enough that some women took it all the way to a courtroom. Here is the rule almost nobody expects. In a number of states through the middle of the 20th century, a woman could sue a man for breach of promise if he broke off an engagement without good cause, arguing in court that the broken promise to marry had cost her real, measurable damages. These were sometimes called heart-balm suits, part of a wider category of law that treated a broken heart as something a courtroom could actually put a dollar figure on. The reasoning was blunt and, for its time, not unreasonable. since an engaged woman had often turned down other suitors, spent money preparing a household, and put her reputation on the line through a newspaper announcement, all based on a promise one man made and then failed to keep. A wave of states had already begun restricting these lawsuits back in the 1930s, part of what was called heart balm reform. The laws were not uniform across the country, and some states still allowed a jilted woman her day in court well into the mid-century. What the arrangement reveals is how seriously an engagement was treated as a binding social contract, not just a romantic gesture either party could walk away from freely. A promise ring, a pinning ceremony, and a newspaper announcement were treated almost like evidence, proof a promise had genuinely been made in front of witnesses. And once that promise was actually kept all the way to the altar, a whole new set of unwritten rules was waiting, starting with who accompanied a couple on their very first date. For a couple in the earliest stages of courtship, a first date rarely happened alone. Double dating with another established couple, often a close friend and her own steady boyfriend, was the expected format, giving a young woman built-in company and a witness to the whole evening at once. It also gave a nervous new couple something to talk about besides each other, since the other pair provided conversation, energy, and a buffer against any awkward silence. Parents generally approved of double dates far more readily than a solo outing, partly because it echoed the same chaperone logic that had governed courtship for generations: safety and reputation protected through numbers rather than direct supervision. As a couple got more serious and moved toward going steady, solo dates became normal, but the double date remained a reliable fallback for a new pairing still finding its footing. Once a couple had proven themselves in public that way, the rules governing exactly how physical they were allowed to get became a great deal more specific. Physical affection had its own unwritten scale, with a peck on the cheek considered fine in public, a proper kiss acceptable at the end of a date, and anything beyond that treated as a serious risk to a girl's reputation if word ever got out. Terms like necking and petting were common in teenage slang of the era, and advice columns treated the whole question as a matter of a young woman's self-control rather than a decision both people were actually making together. Church youth groups, school assemblies, and parents alike reinforced the same message from every direction, that a girl's value was tied directly to how well she held that line, while a boy who pushed past it risked far less social damage for trying. Cars became a genuine flashpoint in this rule, private and largely out of sight of a watching porch light, which is exactly why so much of the era's anxiety about young couples centered on one particular kind of evening out. The drive-in movie theater hit its peak in the 1950s, with thousands of screens operating across the country by the middle of the decade, and it quickly became one of the most popular date destinations in America. Advertised as wholesome, affordable family entertainment, a carload of teenagers could watch a double feature for the price of a single regular ticket, making it an easy, low-cost date for a young man watching his budget. The same venue carried a second, less official reputation after dark, since a parked car with the movie mostly ignored made the drive-in a byword for the kind of closeness every other unwritten rule was designed to prevent. Parents were well aware of this split reputation, which is part of why a first drive-in date often came with a double date built in. That same tug between a wholesome public face and a much less supervised reality showed up again at the school dances every teenager in town was expected to attend. School dances, church socials, and sock hops filled the gap the drive-in could not, offering a fully chaperoned, brightly lit space where teenagers could socialize under direct adult supervision the entire time. A teacher, a minister, or a rotating group of parents typically stood along the walls, watching for anything that crossed the line, and the lights generally stayed up bright enough that nothing resembling shadow or privacy was really possible. These dances functioned as a kind of safe practice ground for courtship, low stakes enough that an awkward conversation or an unanswered dance request would not follow a teenager for long, while still teaching the exact social choreography. Who asks whom, who pays for refreshments, how close is too close, that the more serious rules of dating would later demand. For girls especially, a school dance was also where the lessons learned in an entirely separate classroom got their first real test in front of an actual boy. By the 1950s, home economics was standard curriculum in American public high schools, and it went well beyond cooking and sewing. Many courses included dedicated units on dating etiquette, household budgeting, and what textbooks of the era openly called marriage and family living. The coursework came complete with assigned readings, exams, and sometimes a mock household budget exercise built around a hypothetical husband's imagined salary. Girls were taught, as literal graded schoolwork, how to plan a menu for a husband's dinner, how to manage a household budget, and how to conduct themselves properly while dating, treating marriage preparation as seriously as any academic subject on the schedule. The clear assumption underneath the entire curriculum was that nearly every girl in the room was headed toward the exact same destination, and the same magazines that ran her favorite fashion spreads were quietly reinforcing that lessons every single month. Magazines like 17, which launched in 1944 and quickly became required reading for American teenage girls, ran regular advice columns coaching readers through nearly every stage of courtship, from what to say on a first date to how to handle a boy who called too often or not often enough. Etiquette writers like Emily Post, whose guide had been a household reference since 1922 and was revised repeatedly through the decade, laid out precise, almost scripted instructions for how an introduction, a call, and an engagement were each properly conducted. These guides did not just describe existing customs, they actively shaped them, giving an entire generation of young women a shared script to follow so specific that two girls who had never met could recognize the exact same rules governing their own separate courtships in different states. A girl who deviated from the script risked being read as improper or, just as damaging, unsophisticated, someone who simply did not know any better. What the charm guides ultimately sold was control in a situation that otherwise felt entirely unpredictable. The promise that following the correct steps in the correct order would reliably produce the correct outcome. A proposal. That promise was never fully true, of course, since plenty of women who followed every rule perfectly still ended up disappointed. But the appeal of a clear rule book in matters of the heart has never really gone away, especially once a couple actually reached the point of setting a wedding date. Once a couple was formally engaged, the expected length of the engagement itself followed its own loose but real convention, generally somewhere around a year, long enough to plan a proper wedding, save money for a household, and let both families adjust to the news. Even so, a shorter engagement was not unheard of, especially when a young man was about to ship out for military service, compressing months of planning into a matter of weeks. But not so long that people started to wonder what the delay actually meant. A notably short engagement could invite quiet speculation about the reason for the rush, while a notably long one could suggest the match was somehow unsettled or that the groom was dragging his feet. That year of engagement was also when the heaviest planning happened: the invitations, the dress, and the guest list. That year of engagement mattered even more, given just how young most couples actually were when they reached it in the first place. According to U.S. Census Bureau records, the median age at first marriage in 1950 was about 20 years old for American women and around 22 or 23 for men, among the youngest marrying ages recorded anywhere in 20th century census data. Many women were already engaged or planning toward it well before they finished their teenage years, meaning most of the rules covered in this video were being followed by girls who were, by modern standards, still remarkably young. That youth was not accidental. It was the natural result of a culture that treated marriage as the expected, almost mandatory next step right after high school, with going steady, pinning, an engagement functioning almost like a conveyor belt, moving a couple steadily toward the altar starting in their teens. Marrying young was not seen as reckless the way it might be viewed today. It was simply on schedule, which helps explain why the overall marriage rate itself was running near one of the highest points the entire century would ever see. The U.S. marriage rate in the years following World War II, continuing into the early 1950s, sat near a 20th century high point, part of what historians generally call the post-war marriage boom that began once millions of servicemen returned home starting in 1946. Weddings were, quite simply, everywhere, and an unmarried woman well into her 20s could start to feel like something of an outlier among her own friends and cousins. That sheer volume of weddings is part of why the unwritten rules covered in this video carried so much weight, since nearly everyone was moving through the exact same sequence at roughly the exact same time, comparing notes, watching each other's progress, and reinforcing the same expectations by sheer repetition. With that many weddings happening at once, the machinery built around planning one, the showers, the registries, the gifts, became an entire social industry of its own. Etiquette of the era was strict about exactly who was allowed to host a bride's wedding shower, and it was not supposed to be her own mother or any other close member of her immediate family. That job belonged to a bridesmaid, a close friend, or a more distant relative, since a shower thrown by the bride's own mother could look uncomfortably like the family was simply fishing for gifts on her behalf. The rule sounds oddly specific today, but it reflected a much larger 1950s instinct that generosity had to appear spontaneous and voluntary rather than solicited, even when everyone involved understood perfectly well that the shower had been carefully planned for weeks in advance. Guests brought gifts meant to help furnish the couple's first household, and a bride was increasingly expected to have already told her guests exactly what she wanted, through a formal tool that department stores were only just beginning to perfect. Formal bridal registries at department stores became an increasingly standard part of wedding planning through the 1950s, letting a bride list the china pattern, the silverware, and the household goods she actually wanted before her shower and wedding even happened. It spared guests the guesswork, and it spared the couple a house full of 5 identical toasters. The registry represented a small but real shift. An engaged woman was now expected to know, specify, and manage the material assembly of her own future household well before the wedding day arrived. All of that planning, the shower, the registry, the engagement year, was really in service of a much older idea about how courtship was supposed to work, one built on implication rather than anything said outright. Underneath every single rule in this video sat one final, unwritten expectation, that real feelings were rarely supposed to be stated directly at all. A ring, a class ring worn on a chain, a fraternity pin, a porch light switching off, a newspaper announcement, these were the actual language of 1950s courtship, far more than any spoken declaration of love ever was. A couple could move through calling, going steady, pinning, and engagement without either person ever having to say the plainest version of how they felt, because the rituals themselves said it for them, publicly and unambiguously, to an entire watching community. It was a language built almost entirely out of objects and gestures rather than words, and looking back at all 30 of these rules together is where the real question finally comes into focus. Looking back at all 30 of these rules, what stands out is not the ring or the porch light. It is how much structure an entire culture built around something as unpredictable as love. Some of it was genuinely unfair to women, worth being honest about rather than romanticized. But there was also something real in a courtship that unfolded slowly and in public. What is worth keeping is how seriously one generation treated the idea of getting it right. Thank you for spending this time with me, digging through old charm guides and courtship rules most of us never learned growing up. If a rule like the porch light or the shoebox of letters sounds like something your own family kept, I hope you will share a little of that memory. Subscribe if you want more of these forgotten codes brought back to life, one story at a time, and I will see you in the next one.